A nurse on the night shift notices bruises on an elderly patient, black. What seemed like a routine checkup quickly turns into something much more disturbing. Trusting her instincts, the nurse makes a 911 call that changes everything. Comment below where you're watching from. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel. The corridors of Fairview Medical Center buzzed with a muted chaos, the sound of muffled footsteps and distant beeping machines filling the sterile air. Tamara Wilson stepped through the sliding glass doors, clutching the strap of her bag. This was only her third night on rotation, and every shift in this vast, impersonal hospital felt like an initiation into a world that was colder than she had imagined. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, washing everything in a pale glow that deepened the shadows lurking in every corner. Tamara adjusted her uniform and took a deep breath as she walked toward the nurse's station, determined to make it through the night without a hitch. Yet, beneath her professional demeanor, doubt gnawed at her. She was still getting used to the fast pace, the endless noise, and the cold efficiency that seemed to govern everything. "Wilson," called out a nurse from behind the station's desk. She was older, with weary eyes and a clipped voice. "You've got rooms 403 through 409, and you'll also need to check on Mr. Samuel Hayes in 411. Tamara nodded, flipping through the files she had been handed. The name Mr. Hayes jumped out at her, a black man, 78 years old, recovering from a stroke. She made a mental note to check on him soon. The older nurse leaned closer and lowered her voice. "He can be difficult," she added. "Not hostile, but he's one of those patients who likes to complain about everything." Tamara gave a polite smile, though the woman's tone left a sour taste in her mouth. "I'll do my best," she said, feeling the first hints of unease settle in. As she headed toward the locker room to store her things, Tamara tried to shake off the unsettling vibe. There was always something slightly off in how some of the staff referred to certain patients, especially the older ones. It wasn't just impatience, it was something colder, almost dismissive, as if the elderly, especially those who were poor or from marginalized backgrounds, weren't worth their time. She changed into her scrubs, smoothing out the wrinkles with anxious hands, and pulled her braided hair back into a tight bun. Looking at her reflection in the mirror, she whispered, "You can do this. You're here to help." With one last deep breath, she grabbed her stethoscope and patient charts, then headed toward the dimly lit hallway that stretched into the heart of the medical center. When Tamara entered room 411, she was greeted by the faint hum of medical equipment and the steady beep of a heart monitor. The room smelled of disinfectant, with a sharp undercurrent of antiseptic soap. In the hospital bed lay Mr. Samuel Hayes, his frail body partially propped up against a stack of pillows. His thin, ashen face was turned toward the window, where the night loomed outside, vast and quiet. "Good evening, Mr. Hayes," Tamara greeted him softly as she approached the bed. "I'm Tamara, your nurse for tonight. How are you feeling?" Mr. Hayes turned his head slowly, his movements heavy and deliberate, as if every motion cost him more than he could afford. His brown eyes met hers, sharp but clouded with exhaustion and something else, something deeper. "Same as always," he replied hoarsely, his voice barely more than a whisper. "Tired. Just tired." Tamara noticed the way his hands rested limply on the blanket, the skin paper-thin and dotted with small bruises. But it wasn't just age showing in those bruises. There were dark, oblong marks around his wrists, too uniform to be accidental. "Do your hands hurt?" she asked, gently taking one of his hands into hers to inspect the bruises more closely. The skin felt cold and fragile beneath her fingers, Mr. Hayes stiffened slightly, but didn't pull away. "It's nothing," he muttered. "Just clumsy old me, I guess." Tamara frowned. The bruises were too evenly spaced to be from a fall. They looked more like the kind of marks left by restraints, tight straps or rough hands. But if that was the case, why hadn't anyone mentioned it in his file? She knelt beside his bed, keeping her voice low and calm. "Mr. Hayes, did something happen? Did someone hurt you?" He didn't answer right away. His gaze drifted back toward the window, as if searching for something out in the night. After a long pause, he whispered, "They don't like me much here." Tamara's heart tightened at the quiet resignation in his words. She wanted to press further, to ask more questions, but the fear in his voice stopped her. Whoever had left those marks, whether through carelessness or malice, had made sure that Mr. Hayes would stay silent. Back at the nurse's station, Tamara pulled up his chart again, flipping through the notes in search of anything unusual. But the records were frustratingly vague. There were no mentions of falls, accidents, or restraint use. It was as if the bruises on his hands, and whatever had caused them, simply didn't exist in the hospital's documentation. "Anything you need?" A voice broke through her thoughts. It was the same nurse who had assigned her patients earlier. Tamara hesitated. "Do you know anything about Mr. Hayes in 411? She asked. "I noticed some bruising on his hands, and I wanted to make sure he's getting the right care." The older nurse gave a dismissive shrug. "He's just an old man who makes a fuss about everything. Don't read too much into it. These things happen." The casual dismissal ignited a flicker of anger in Tamara's chest, but she kept her voice even. Did he fall, or was he restrained at some point? The nurse's expression darkened slightly, as if Tamara had crossed an unspoken line. "I told you, Wilson. He's fine. You're new here, so let me give you some advice. Don't waste your energy on patients who won't appreciate it." Tamara nodded politely, though inside her frustration grew. Something was wrong, and she wasn't going to let it slide no matter how much her colleagues tried to brush it off. Throughout the night, Tamara checked in on Mr. Hayes as often as she could without raising suspicion. Each time, she found him more withdrawn, his eyes clouded with a silent fear. When she asked if he needed anything, he always shook his head. It was as if he had given up asking for help. The bruises on his hands haunted her thoughts. What if they weren't from an accident? What if someone had hurt him, and was counting on the fact that no one would care enough to notice? As the hours dragged on, Tamara's unease grew. Every interaction with her colleagues confirmed what she had suspected. The hospital ran on cold efficiency, and patients like Mr. Hayes, old, black, and quietly suffering, were treated as little more than inconvenient burdens. By the time her shift ended, Tamara felt drained, but not from the work. It was the weight of unspoken truths, of injustice hidden beneath a veneer of professionalism, that left her exhausted. She knew that if she stayed silent, nothing would change. But speaking up could cost her everything: her reputation, her career, and her future in the medical field. Standing outside Mr. Hayes's room one last time before heading home, Tamara whispered a quiet promise to herself. "I'm not going to let this go." The night outside was still and dark, but something had shifted within her, and as the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon, Tamara knew that this was only the beginning. Tamara's determination to uncover the truth about Mr. Hayes grew stronger as the days passed. Every time she thought about the bruises on his hands, she felt a gnawing sense of responsibility. Something was happening to him, and she couldn't walk away, no matter how much her colleagues insisted it was nothing. When she returned for her next night shift, the hospital seemed even colder. The fluorescent lights flickered slightly in the hallway, and the faint hum of monitors created a backdrop of uneasy quiet. Tamara slipped into her scrubs, tying her braids into a tight bun, and headed straight for Mr. Hayes's room. As she opened the door to room 411, she found him lying motionless in bed. His eyes were closed, and for a brief moment, her heart sank. Had something happened to him while she was away? But then his eyelids fluttered open, and he turned his head slowly toward her. "You came back," he murmured, his voice low and hoarse. Tamara offered him a small, reassuring smile. "Of course I did. How are you feeling tonight, Mr. Hayes?" He gave a weak shrug. "Same as always. Just tired." Tamara checked his vitals, her hands moving with practiced care. As she adjusted his IV line, she noticed fresh bruises on his arm. They were faint, but unmistakable, spread across his forearm like fading fingerprints. "Did someone grab you?" she asked gently, keeping her voice low. Mr. Hayes avoided her gaze. "Just the usual," he muttered. "They get rough sometimes when they're in a hurry." Tamara's heart clenched. She knew that medical staff could be rushed and careless, but this was different. There was no excuse for bruising a patient like this. And yet, Mr. Hayes spoke with the resignation of someone who had long since stopped expecting kindness. Determined to do more, Tamara stayed by his side for longer than usual, helping him with small tasks, adjusting his pillows, smoothing out the wrinkles in his blanket, and refilling his water cup. Each act of care seemed to lift a small weight from his weary shoulders. For the first time, he began to open up to her. "They don't like me much," he said quietly. "I can see it in their eyes. I'm just a nuisance to them." Tamara pulled a chair closer to his bed and sat down. "I'm sorry they make you feel that way," she said softly, "but I'm here now. You're not alone." Mr. Hayes's eyes glistened with unspoken emotion. "You know," he continued, his voice barely above a whisper, "I've dealt with people like them my whole life. They see my skin, and they think they know everything about me, like I don't matter." Tamara nodded, her chest tightening with empathy. "It's not right," she whispered, "and it's not your fault." For a moment, the room was filled with a heavy silence, as if the weight of his experiences hung in the air between them. Tamara wanted to say more, to comfort him, but she knew that words alone couldn't undo the damage of a lifetime of prejudice. When Tamara stepped out of the room, she found one of the senior nurses waiting in the hallway. The woman crossed her arms, her expression cold. "You've been spending a lot of time with Mr. Hayes," she said, her voice edged with disapproval. "Don't get too attached, Wilson. He's just one patient." Tamara forced a polite smile, though inside frustration simmered. "I'm just doing my job." The nurse scoffed. "You're doing more than that. And trust me, it's not worth it. He's the kind of patient who complains no matter what you do. You'll see." Tamara clenched her fists at her sides, struggling to keep her anger in check. "I think every patient deserves the same care," she said, her voice steady. The senior nurse gave her a condescending smile. "You're young. You'll learn." Tamara bit her tongue and watched the woman walk away, her heels clicking against the polished floor. She knew that challenging the status quo wouldn't be easy, but she couldn't ignore what was happening. Not now. Throughout the night, Tamara continued to notice small acts of neglect toward Mr. Hayes. His dinner tray was left untouched for hours before someone finally brought it to him, and when they did, the food was cold. When he pressed the call button for assistance, no one came. Tamara found him struggling to sit up, his frail hands trembling as he tried to lift himself. "I'm sorry, Mr. Hayes," she whispered, helping him back into a comfortable position. "They should have been here sooner." He gave her a weary smile, as if to say, "I've learned not to expect much." Tamara's frustration grew with every passing hour. She wanted to scream at her colleagues, to demand that they treat Mr. Hayes with the dignity he deserved. But she knew that confronting them directly would only make things worse, for both her and Mr. Hayes. As her shift wore on, Tamara noticed other unsettling patterns. It wasn't just Mr. Hayes who was being neglected. Other patients, mostly elderly, mostly black, were receiving the same cold, indifferent treatment. Their calls were ignored, their meals delayed, their medications administered without care. Tamara felt a knot form in her stomach. This wasn't just a matter of negligence, it was a pattern, a quiet, insidious form of discrimination that had been allowed to take root in the very place where people were supposed to be cared for. And the worst part was that no one seemed to care. When her shift finally ended, Tamara sat in the empty break room, her thoughts swirling like a storm. She had seen enough to know that what was happening to Mr. Hayes, and others like him, wasn't an accident. It was a systemic problem, fueled by prejudice and indifference. But what could she do? She was just a student, a temporary nurse with no real power. If she spoke up, she risked losing everything she had worked for. And yet, the thought of staying silent made her feel sick. Tamara closed her eyes and took a deep breath. She knew what she had to do. It wouldn't be easy, and it wouldn't be without consequences. But she couldn't ignore the truth any longer. Mr. Hayes and every other patient in that hospital deserved better. And if no one else was going to fight for them, she would. The weight of Tamara's decision pressed heavily on her shoulders as she returned to Fairview Medical Center for another shift. Her unease only deepened with each step through the sterile hallways. She had made up her mind. She would find out what was happening to Mr. Hayes and the other patients, but the more she observed, the clearer it became that uncovering the truth wouldn't be easy. Something darker lurked beneath the surface of the hospital's routines. As Tamara approached the nurse's station to pick up her new assignments, she noticed Dr. Harper standing nearby. A man in his late 50s, he carried himself with an air of untouchable authority. His salt and pepper hair was neatly combed, and his pressed white coat gleamed under the fluorescent lights. Every nurse within earshot seemed to tense slightly in his presence. It was as though his very existence cast a shadow over the entire floor. Harper was one of the most respected physicians at Fairview, a man known for his no-nonsense attitude and clinical efficiency. But Tamara had heard enough whispers in the break room to know that his influence came at a cost. He wielded his authority like a weapon, dismissing those who questioned him and intimidating those who didn't fall in line. Now, with her growing suspicions about the treatment of Mr. Hayes, Tamara found herself directly in his path. "Wilson?" Harper called out, his sharp gaze locking onto her as she tried to walk past. Tamara froze mid-step. "Yes, Dr. Harper," she replied, keeping her voice even despite the nervous knot forming in her stomach. He approached her with a measured stride, holding a clipboard casually in one hand. "I hear you've been spending quite a bit of time with Mr. Hayes," he said, his tone neutral but laced with something cold, something dangerous. Tamara straightened her posture. "I'm just making sure he's getting the care he needs." A flicker of amusement danced in Harper's eyes. "He's not your only patient, you know. Don't get distracted." Tamara felt the unspoken threat hanging in the air. She had crossed an invisible boundary by caring too much, by noticing what others had chosen to ignore. "I'll keep that in mind," she said, forcing herself to meet his gaze without flinching. For a moment, Harper said nothing. Then, with a faint smirk, he turned away. "Good," he murmured, as if the conversation had never taken place. Tamara stood frozen in place, her heart racing. She knew without a doubt that Harper was involved, that he was part of the reason why patients like Mr. Hayes were being mistreated. But she also knew that confronting him directly would be dangerous. Harper wasn't just a doctor. He was someone with connections, someone who could ruin her career with a few words. That night, Tamara kept her head down, doing her best to blend into the background. But she didn't stop watching. She noticed how Harper treated certain patients with cold indifference, barely glancing at their charts before dismissing their concerns. She saw how the other nurses followed his lead, avoiding eye contact with the elderly black patients and rushing through their care. Every interaction felt like a punch to the gut, each slight and unspoken message. You don't matter. You never did. When Tamara returned to Mr. Hayes's room later that evening, she found him struggling to sit up in bed, his frail arms trembling under the effort. "Here, let me help you," she whispered, rushing to his side. As she adjusted his pillows, she noticed new bruises forming along his wrists, marks that looked suspiciously like they had been made by restraints. Her stomach churned with anger. Someone had restrained him without cause, and she knew exactly who was responsible. "They did it again, didn't they?" she asked quietly. Mr. Hayes gave her a tired, knowing look. "They always do." Tamara's hands clenched into fists at her sides. This wasn't negligence. This was abuse, plain and simple. And the fact that it was happening under the guise of medical care made it all the more horrifying. Determined to find answers, Tamara decided to check the hospital's records. She knew it was risky. Digging into patient files without explicit permission could get her into serious trouble. But she didn't care. If no one else was going to protect Mr. Hayes, she would. In the quiet hours of the night, when the rest of the staff was preoccupied, Tamara slipped into the records room. The dim light flickered overhead as she searched through the files, her fingers trembling with urgency. When she finally found Mr. Hayes's chart, her worst fears were confirmed. The notes were vague and incomplete, filled with inconsistencies. There were references to aggressive behavior that didn't match anything she had witnessed. And there, buried at the bottom of the report, was a chilling detail. Restraints applied, approved by Dr. Harper. Tamara's hands shook as she closed the file. This was it, proof that Harper was behind the mistreatment. He had authorized the use of restraints on Mr. Hayes, knowing full well that they weren't necessary. And worse, he had likely done the same to other patients. The next day, Tamara confronted Harper in the hallway. Her heart pounded in her chest, but she forced herself to stand tall. "Dr. Harper," she said, blocking his path, "we need to talk about Mr. Hayes." Harper raised an eyebrow, clearly amused by her audacity. "What about him?" "I saw his chart," Tamara said, her voice steady despite the fear gnawing at her insides. "You authorized the restraints. Why?" Harper's smile faded, replaced by a cold, calculating expression. "Because it was necessary," he said flatly. "He's old, confused, and prone to causing trouble. Restraints were for his own good." Tamara's blood boiled at the casual cruelty in his words. "That's not true, and you know it. He's not aggressive. He's scared, and you're abusing him." For a moment, Harper said nothing. Then his lips curled into a sinister smile. "Careful, Wilson. You're treading on dangerous ground." Tamara refused to back down. "I won't let this continue. Someone has to stop you." Harper leaned in closer, his voice low and threatening. And who do you think they'll believe? A temporary nurse? Or me, a respected doctor with years of experience? Tamara's heart raced, but she stood her ground. "I've documented everything," she whispered. "I have proof, and I'm not the only one who's noticed." For the first time, Harper's confident demeanor cracked, a flicker of uncertainty flashing across his face. But it was gone as quickly as it had appeared. "You have no idea what you're getting yourself into," he hissed. "But don't say I didn't warn you." With that, he turned on his heel and walked away, leaving Tamara standing alone in the hallway, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew she had made a powerful enemy, and that the real fight was only just beginning. The confrontation with Dr. Harper left Tamara shaken but resolute. The way he dismissed her concerns, and the smug confidence that his authority would shield him from consequences, only solidified her determination. If no one else in the hospital was willing to protect Mr. Hayes and the others, she would do it herself. But the cost of standing up to someone like Harper was steep. She knew that if she wasn't careful, she could lose everything: her job, her reputation, her future in medicine. Yet, the thought of walking away, of leaving Mr. Hayes and others to suffer in silence, was unbearable. As Tamara stepped back into the hallway, she knew what she had to do. The time for hesitation was over. That night, Tamara returned to Mr. Hayes's room, her mind buzzing with plans. She gently sat by his side and took his frail hand in hers. His dark eyes flickered with exhaustion, but a trace of warmth lingered beneath the surface. "Mr. Hayes," she whispered, "I need your help. We have to stop them." Mr. Hayes looked at her with wary suspicion. "Stop who?" "Dr. Harper and the others," Tamara replied softly. "They have no right to treat you like this. I've seen the records. They're using restraints on you without cause, and it's not just you. They're hurting other patients, too." For a moment, Mr. Hayes said nothing. Then he let out a weary sigh. "I've been fighting people like Harper my whole life, young lady. And let me tell you, folks like him don't lose." Tamara's heart ached at the resignation in his voice. "They do, if we stand together," she whispered. "I've already started documenting what I've seen, but I need your story too. If you're willing to speak up, we can stop this. We can make sure no one else gets hurt." Mr. Hayes hesitated, his eyes clouded with doubt. What if no one listens? What if it just makes things worse? Tamara squeezed his hand gently. "I'll be with you every step of the way," she promised. "You're not alone in this." After a long, tense moment, Mr. Hayes gave a slow nod. "All right," he murmured. "Let's do it." The next few nights were a blur of covert actions. Tamara began documenting everything she witnessed: every delayed meal, every time a call button went unanswered, every instance of carelessness and neglect. She spoke with other patients, mostly elderly and black, and gathered their testimonies. Many of them were too afraid to speak out, but a few, inspired by Mr. Hayes's bravery, agreed to share their experiences. Tamara recorded everything on her phone, taking photos of bruises, noting the times of incidents, and capturing snippets of conversations. She knew she was playing a dangerous game. If Harper or any of the other staff caught wind of what she was doing, it would all be over. But she couldn't stop. She wouldn't stop. Too much was at stake. The night Tamara finally decided to call the police was one of the longest of her life. As soon as her shift ended, she slipped into an empty break room, her heart pounding. With trembling hands, she dialed 911. "This is Tamara Wilson," she whispered into the phone. "I'm a nurse at Fairview Medical Center, and I need to report elder abuse and discrimination by a doctor. His name is Dr. Harper." The dispatcher asked her a series of questions, and Tamara answered as calmly and thoroughly as she could, though her heart threatened to beat out of her chest. The police assured her they would send officers to investigate within the hour. Hanging up the phone, Tamara leaned against the wall, her breath shaky. There was no turning back now. When the officers arrived, Tamara met them at the entrance. 2 officers, Johnson and Rodriguez, introduced themselves and followed her to Mr. Hayes's room. Mr. Hayes sat up slightly as they entered, his expression a mixture of fear and hope. "Mr. Hayes," Officer Johnson said kindly, "we're here to help. Can you tell us what's been happening?" Mr. Hayes glanced at Tamara, who gave him a reassuring nod. Taking a deep breath, he began to speak. His voice trembled at first, but as he recounted the mistreatment he had endured, how he had been restrained without cause, how his calls for help had gone unanswered, how he had been treated like a burden, his voice grew stronger. Tamara watched as the officers listened attentively, their expressions growing more serious with each word. Officer Rodriguez took detailed notes, her jaw tightening with quiet anger. When Mr. Hayes finished speaking, Officer Johnson turned to Tamara. "We'll need to speak with Dr. Harper next," he said. As if summoned by fate, Dr. Harper appeared in the hallway just as they stepped out of Mr. Hayes's room. His eyes narrowed as he spotted the officers, and a slow, disdainful smile spread across his face. "Can I help you, officers?" he asked smoothly, as if their presence was nothing more than a minor inconvenience. "We're here to investigate a report of elder abuse," Officer Rodriguez said, her tone professional but firm. "We need to ask you a few questions, Dr. Harper." Harper's smile didn't falter. "I see," he said, glancing briefly at Tamara. "I take it you've been listening to Nurse Wilson's colorful imagination." Tamara clenched her fists, but Officer Johnson spoke before she could respond. "This is a serious matter, Dr. Harper," he said. "We'd appreciate your cooperation." Harper chuckled softly. "Of course. I have nothing to hide." What followed was a display of arrogance that left everyone stunned. Rather than deny the accusations, Harper openly admitted to restraining Mr. Hayes and dismissing his complaints. "These people," he said with a sneer, "they're a waste of resources. I'm simply ensuring that the hospital's time and effort are used wisely." Tamara's stomach churned at the casual cruelty of his words, but she stood her ground. "This isn't about efficiency," she said quietly. "It's about abuse." Harper's smile faded, replaced by a look of cold disdain. "You really don't understand how the world works, do you, Wilson?" he hissed. "People like me don't face consequences. I'm too valuable, too connected." But Harper's confidence was short-lived. Officer Johnson stepped forward, pulling out a pair of handcuffs. "Dr. Harper," he said firmly, "you're under arrest for elder abuse and violating the civil rights of your patients." The clink of the cuffs echoed in the hallway as Harper's smug expression melted into disbelief. "You can't do this," he sputtered, struggling against the officers. "Do you have any idea who I am?" Rodriguez's voice was calm but unwavering. "Your position doesn't put you above the law, Dr. Harper." As Harper was led away, the staff gathered in the hallway, their expressions a mixture of shock, relief, and silent vindication. Tamara watched him go, her heart pounding with a strange mix of fear and triumph. She had done it. She had stood up to him and won. Back in Mr. Hayes's room, Tamara sat beside him, her hand resting gently on his. "It's over," she whispered. "He can't hurt you anymore." Mr. Hayes let out a shaky breath, tears welling in his eyes. "Thank you," he murmured, "for believing me, for standing up for me." Tamara squeezed his hand. "You're not alone," she said softly, "and I'm not going anywhere." As the first light of dawn crept through the window, Tamara knew that her journey was far from over. There would be more battles to fight, more injustices to confront. But for now, she allowed herself a moment of peace, knowing that she had done the right thing, no matter the cost. Thank you for watching this video to the end. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss new episodes. Leave comments and share this video with your friends. There are more exciting stories to come. Watch the next videos on our channel and discover other stories that will not leave you indifferent.